Ladies and gentlemen, Simon has agreed to take questions and discussions. We've got just under half an hour. Simon, I thought I might start the ball rolling and ask about ethics and foreign policy in a world of many different cultures. Is orienting our foreign policy according to our ethics going to be as effective in a world that contains many cultures and many ethical systems?
Yes, it is, for the following reasons. First of all, very few people, in my experience, working quite extensively offshore and mainly within the Asian region, very few people there are prepared to take you seriously if you are like a chameleon, willing to change your colour to whatever the circumstance. They want to know that you have some substance to who you are and what you stand for. But they don't want you to take the next step, which is to assume that therefore you can impose this or be indifferent to their own interests. They are much happier to say, well, let's talk about this and have real engagement. What then is revealed is that the differences that occur across human societies tend to be of two kinds. Firstly, you can find cultures that have the same values, the same answer to the question, what is good, but express them differently. I remember seeing an Australian feeling terribly offended by the offer of a gift from a Japanese businessman who said, oh, this is terribly improper, you're trying to distort my judgment and all the rest. The Japanese person was saying, but this is a token of esteem. I thought that Australians, the Aussies like friendship. Oh, that's what it's about. Or we just sort of go to the pub or something like that. But once they saw that the same value was being expressed differently, there was a capacity to relate much better. And yet far too often when you're dealing in another cultural environment, you'll take a specific piece of behaviour and you will misinterpret it as indicating a different core set of values and principles. So it's very important to check. But the area where real differences can arise is in the priority accorded to certain values at different points in time and across different cultures. So just to go back to my example about 9/11, if on the 10th of September 2001 you'd gone to the United States of America and conducted a survey and asked Americans to list their values and then to put them in order of priority, very, very close to the top you would have found liberty. We are the land of the free, we've amended our constitution, free speech, you can pretty much say what you like, we don't mind, there can be strife all over the place as a result of this. The same day you conduct a survey of that kind in China, liberty will be in the list, but it will be subordinate to harmony or order. And although the government in China quite often uses this for its own purposes, nonetheless they are saying something which is true to the ordinary Chinese when they talk about the importance of harmony or order. It's something they genuinely believe in. And you can see the differences between the United States and the choices they make. They put out and they pick up the apple of liberty when they get the chance, with the Chinese say, I'll have the orange of harmony or something of that kind, different choices. 2 days later, of course, after the attacks are mounted, we go back to the United States and we see that the value of liberty drops quite noticeably, and roaring up the charts comes security. And exactly as the Greeks predict, so the Americans make a different choice. They now put out their hands and they pick up the orange of security. And what happens? They change their laws, they suspend habeas corpus through the Patriot Act, they change physical infrastructure. This architecture of choice is real, it's not just an imagined phenomenon. And in some senses, for a period of time, the Americans and the Chinese become more like each other. They've got more to talk about. They cooperate around these issues of security as they do with other regimes who wouldn't necessarily be common fellows, if you like, if it hadn't been for this change in the value structure.
Thank you. Sharon Minahan. Could you comment in a little bit more detail, please, on how you suggest that the government of the day, wherever it might be, should handle the daily challenge of balancing what they think might be the right, in an ethical sense, decision with what they think is, I don't know, either right or possible in the more realpolitik way.
Pragmatically, yeah.
Yes, I mean, I'm thinking of classic examples such as, you want to criticise a country's treatment of human rights, but you know that it could have devastating economic consequences for your population. Could you sort of say what's your guide to how the government should balance that?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm a particularly good guide, but I'll give you my own views on it. I think the first thing is that you need to know in your own judgment what is right. In other words, you need to have a point where you can agree for yourself at the level of values and principles what it is that you think you ought to do. Having done that, and I say that because it might seem like an obvious thing, but I think often we don't. We think the better thing to do is not ever define it, because then we would have maximum freedom to move, because nothing is pegged down. There's a kind of plausible deniability at the ethical level. But I think it's just an act of bad faith to do that. Secondly, there's a maximum in ethics, which is ought implies can. You're not under any moral obligation to do the impossible. So there may be certain things which are literally beyond your scope of power to do it, and you need to recognise that and not beat yourself up if you have no capacity to act. But there's a Buddhist notion too around righteousness, which it's not just enough to be sincere, you also have to have skillful means. And one of the things that people wrongly think about being ethical is that it's like being a little fluffy bunny on the roadway of life, and there's a big truck called reality bearing down on you, and you're destined to be roadkill. This is not what ethics is about. It's not about just being nice and cuddly and irrelevant or dead. It's also about having a creative and a critical capacity to find inflection points. These are these skillful means, for which you can often, not always, but often, find a way to redefine the terms in which you're being presented with a dilemma or just a choice, so that you can reconcile some of these tensions that are there. So you may very well find, not because you're trying just to protect yourself against adverse consequences, there may be better means to employ around a question like human rights, which authentically commend themselves to you than just raising up a big flag and blasting the other side. That may not be the most skillful thing you do. It may also be that it's a degree of prudence attached to it, but you shouldn't be ashamed of that if you've got an underlying reason which can be defended in the first place.
Thank you very much. My name is Reinhard Rösch. I have a question. You said you could make an ethical choice or follow customs and practice.
Unthinking custom and practice.
Unthinking customs and practice, yeah. I thought, could you make an ethical choice to follow custom and practice?
You can make an ethical choice to follow custom and practice. The emphasis about ethics and the difference between ethics and morality is that ethics is impossible without active conscious reflection. So if you take a set of values and principles, many of which have been generated over centuries in response to Socrates' question, so there's a Jewish voice, a Christian voice, an Islamic voice, there's the utilitarians, there's a whole lot of different frameworks of values and principles. Often they are put into a package and they're presented to you. If they're religions, they also contain revealed truths, exemplary laws. Each of those packages is a morality. You open it up, there are the values, there are the principles, and people who advocate that you adopt them say, yes, we've got Socrates' question, here is the answer, follow this one. Now the thing about a moral life is that you can follow a moral life, you can apply these things as a matter of habit, quite uncritically, and if they're things which include kindness to children or respect for nature, we might say it's a better world for that. But the ethical life is a life which is associated directly with the notion of the examined life. And so ethics is always about thinking about what you're doing, consciously reflecting. So you can choose to follow custom and practice as an ethical being, consciously choosing these values and these principles, and to that something highly to be commended. But many people instead, rather than taking that responsibility, either at an individual, organisational or even national level, instead opt for the lesser, what I would say is the lesser choice, which is just to follow a moral convention. And to that extent, if you ask people, and I spend so many times going into places, civilian, military, private sector and public sector, here and abroad, if you ask people, why do you do this, why do you do that, the most common response is, oh, everybody does it like that. That's just the way we do things around here. That's a failure of ethics.
Trevor Rowe.
Thank you. There's an interesting conundrum here, isn't it? Because our value system, and therefore our ethics, say, on human rights, may differ with someone else. And there may be a geopolitical or economic imperative to deal with that other party. Mm-hmm. So do I understand what you're saying? As long as you are true to your ethics or values, recognising that the opposite party is alien to those beliefs, you can, once having identified that, you can then happily engage.
Not necessarily, Trevor. You may, let's put it, you may discover that what you first of all see as being different and troubling is in fact the same value being expressed in a different way. So there's a basis for a conversation about that. You might find that it's a different ordering of those values of a kind which is not particularly consequent to your judgment. But this is not to say that you then simply say, oh, well, I'll deal with anybody once I know them. You might relate to them, you might engage with them, you might seek better to understand, but you might not seek to prosper from that kind of conduct. If there is something which you look at which is so against the grain of who you are and what you stand for, there will be a time when you've got to make a judgment as to whether or not you are prepared to bear the cost of your values and principles. It can't be, there'll be a point where there's no further capacity for you to rationalise self-interest away in the way that sometimes it is tempting to do. And that will be the test. Do you act in a way so that you're prepared to accept the cost? So there may be times when you say, I will continue to engage, I will continue to have this conversation, but I won't secure a material benefit that might otherwise have been available to me.
Let's agree what we agree to disagree on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm arguing that you cannot do that in every case. No, the reality is that I think it's more fluid than that. I think sometimes we don't take advantage of the kinds of, in this area of foreign affairs, the kinds of other alliances that might form. I think that we might be short-term in our view, that we think that we trade an opportunity, but in doing so we lose our moral authority and then we become systemically weaker in the kind of world that I've described. We start to see that we might make one deal here and then a whole field of opportunity closes down to us because people have said, we can't deal with you, you're not sincere, you don't know what you stand for, you will do a deal on any basis, and consequently with it. Now, that's not, as I say, to be this fluffy bunny that's just rolled out. There may be many steps before you get to that point where you can find these inflection points where you can tilt the table again in a way which allows you to prosper across the broader field. But we'd be incredibly naive to think that we can just endlessly accommodate other people if they are fundamentally opposed to the worldview that we hold. But we should still engage, even though we might not prosper.
Gentleman just there.
It's Peter.
Dr. Longstaff, Peter Timmins.
Yeah, hi Peter.
Thanks for a terrific reminder of fundamentals about decision making. But you made a very good connection between foreign policy and governance generally, domestic policy. How do you think we're going? You've been making speeches like this, to my knowledge, for 20 years or so.
Yeah, quixotic existence, isn't it?
Were you heartened to see, for the first time in our history, that in the appointment of the federal ministry, we now have a special Minister of State for the public service and integrity? If you were heartened by that, were you disheartened by the fact that Gary Gray is number 29 in a list of 30 ministers and unlikely to have, I guess, the stature that we might expect of someone who carries that title? Were you heartened by Bruce Barber, the New South Wales Ombudsman, in a speech 2 weeks ago, calling for more integrity in public life and suggesting a need for rethinking about the integrity framework? But were you disheartened by a very underreported response by Christina Keneally, who in Parliament said that she'd noted what the Ombudsman had said, but he seemed to miss the point that the New South Wales public sector was among the most respected public sectors in the world. So I just wonder how you think we're going. Are there some positive signs, but there still seems to be a lot of work ahead?
During the course of the last election, I felt that the standard of our democracy had fallen to its lowest point. I think our parliaments have largely lost their way and have become progressively irrelevant. I think the professionalisation of politics and political parties means that the selection of candidates from the broader community has more or less ended, and it's people who come from a very limited pool, often in ministerial advisors, union officials or whatever, and I don't think we're well served from that. And I thought that the media finally completely lost its position as working in the public interest by trying to help citizens make informed decisions. And instead what it did was it tried to parade itself as being clever analysts of tactics, slip-ups and things like that. The hung parliament may provide an opportunity in this. I've just recently written about it. I think there are a number of reforms we could have. I think there should be a proper career path for parliamentarians without having to join the executive and become a minister. I think we should have a much stronger line of development and opportunity for great parliamentarians, which would help to address that. I think political parties can do it. But one of the areas I think that we need to look at now is a conscious process of decoupling the public service from the political class. And I think as part of that we need to consider seriously, and I proposed this, that we should consider there being a common ethical foundation of values and principles, and we usually only get one or the other, for all elements of the public service in the Commonwealth as a whole, whether it's state, territory, local or federal. And this is not to say that they should not be responsive to the government of the day, but they need to have a capacity to do what politicians will not always do, which is to look at the Australian polity and make sure that no one is missed. If you're not in a marginal seat, you might be missed in these extraordinary things. We need an institution, a democratic institution, so I think it's heartening to see it being discussed. I think it's disheartening to see some of the trivialisation of what's happening in our democracy. And I think there's a really important opportunity to address this in part through the way in which the public service develops in this country.
Lady to the side.
I suppose I'll keep giving speeches and have as much effect as I've had over 20 years.
Janet Fisher. I'm concerned that the war in our participation in the war in Afghanistan is impacting on our credibility worldwide, because there are in fact 2 wars going on, and whilst I'd never condone what happens on the ground, either what US soldiers are being accused of and 3 of our own now, it seems to me that the horror of the CIA drones bombing of villages and what they call the collateral damage is quite extensive. It's very damaging to our credibility and is not being discussed. So what can one do perhaps to raise that? Should one? Because it is, I have to say I want to be protected by security and intelligence operations. In what way can we interfere, and should we raise that as a very significant issue in world foreign affairs?
Well, we should certainly be concerned, and we should certainly raise it, because we are a democratic polity where all of these things are done in our name. We should never forget that. It's us, we're the citizens, and it's in our name that governments act. As to the specifics of it, you've raised a very important question. The development of new technology in military affairs is raising new questions which haven't been adequately addressed at any time in the past. Traditionally, there's been quite a clear nexus between the warrior, if you like, and the use of power. It's become more remote over time. I mean, when the person first picked up a stone and threw that rather than grappling face to face, there was a remoteness there, and then you've got bows and arrows and missiles and other things like that. But there was always a conscious actor there who was in the space in which this was taking place. Unmanned combat aerial vehicles, UCAVs, introduce a new dimension. In one sense, there's still somebody there driving them, but remote from harm's way themselves at a considerable distance. But I think we need to go back to some of the discussions that we had around the use of mines, particularly naval mines, where they were automatic and sort of just set off without discrimination in minefields. And we need to think about what happens if we develop the artificial intelligence capacity and manage that with UCAVs in which they are self-targeting. And that is obviously being experimented with. It's technically possible, but it's a real breach in the general fabric of the way in which war has been waged. We do a lot of work with the military here and overseas, and war is a truly horrible condition. But the thing that Michael Ignatieff from Canada noted some years ago is that the distinction between, we'll put it another way, that ethical restraint is the thing that distinguishes the warrior from the barbarian. And we can never lose that. And as it happens, the Australian Defence Force in 2007 amended its doctrine on leadership, in part, I hope, influenced by some of our work with them. And so now Australia's doctrine on leadership is that it's the use of influence to bring about the willing consent of others in the ethical pursuit of missions. We've made it an explicit part of our doctrine that it's the ethical pursuit of missions, partly because of our own sense of who we are. It's not to say that in the past there was a whole lot of unethical conduct, but there's also a recognition of this point I've been trying to make about moral authority and its wedding to power being more effective. Now, we will be imperfect on occasions, but it's a very big step under Angus Houston's leadership to recognise that there is not a thing called leadership and a thing called ethics, and we try and inject them in. Our doctrine is that leadership is an ethical practice, and that's what we try to develop, which I wish is a lesson which we'd learn in the civilian world of commerce and other things in government, where we have a lot of programs which claim to be about leadership, but in fact they're just management programs and don't really develop this capacity for moral courage and strategic vision.
Hi, Madeline Savitt. I'm wondering, first of all, what you think of China as an emerging Leviathan by most accounts, and the likely path they're going to take in terms of ethics, principle, etc., for the world. And also, quickly, there have been studies that show that people seem to be born with an inherent sense of justice and integrity and fairness, and what you think of that, and whether actually that should be cultivated or can be and is part of the whole program of creating a more ethical society and civic participation.
Yeah, take the second part first. I tend to the view that people are moderately decent by orientation or neutral. I don't buy the idea that people are problem. I think our institutions tend to shape people and make them more one way or another, and that we have an obligation to design better institutions. I fear that what we tend to do these days in our society is to try and deal with risk, including the sorts of risks we've been talking about, by increasing regulation and surveillance in the hope that we can have people never make a bad choice. But the paradox of this is, if you create a world in which no one can choose to do anything wrong, you also create a world in which no one can choose to do anything right. And if you don't practice making responsible decisions, your capacity to do so is lost. Now, we know that's true because of the grand experiment of the Soviet Union. What's interesting about this for China, then, to come to the first part of the question, is to the extent to which the Chinese themselves, in their own ambitions, are producing a society which has got not just a military, economic, but also a cultural resilience, which can see them achieve their objectives in a way which isn't going to be short-lived. The history of China, as you know, is one of expansion, and then usually it's undermined by internal division. This is a problem I still think the Chinese face. They recently decided to cut all tax for the peasant class. They know the risks of a kind of an accumulation of too many people in other centres and things of that kind. So that's more of a domestic thing. Internationally, I think what they're going to do is they're going to speak a language which is constructive and seeks to take the high ground on things like climate change, sustainability, and a number of other issues. But I have no doubt that when it comes to their paramount interests, they will expect conformance in an area. And if you look at the deal that's been done over the last 15 years with the military, where they basically get out of being involved in the economy, and they've got almost an unlimited budget for other things. The shape of what they're doing, and a lot of people have commented on this, is allowing them progressively to have a capacity to be masters of their own destiny. And I think it's going to be a very interesting issue as to how we respond, because that need not be a terrifying thought if the kind of resilience within the Chinese polity of the kind that starts to emerge. And we shouldn't underestimate what an increasingly prosperous society might demand for itself in world affairs. They may really grab the rhetoric and make it real and have a strong sense of investing in being a great good power because of this issue of moral authority. I think they're going to they're working on that consciously at the moment. And you can see that in all sorts of ways. So I think we shouldn't be indifferent to this, but we shouldn't assume the worst either in terms of what China might become.
Okay, last question, gentleman in the middle there.
Returning to your earlier theme on defence forces and ethics, etc., increasingly we need a whole-of-nation approach in foreign policy issues, business, NGOs, government and the military all working together. How do we achieve that? And at the same time, each of those parties have a framework, an ethical framework.
We look for a family resemblance. We don't look for homogeneity. One of the problems you find in ethics is that even in smaller organisations of groups that you're talking about there's a temptation to say that the values and principles must be expressed within an organisational setting in an identical manner right across the board. The better path to take, in my view, is to look for what I would just call a family resemblance, in which institutions with distinctive purposes follow those purposes and develop a particular character, but with a core, if you like, the DNA of values and principles providing the basis for that family resemblance. So if you look at my brothers and sisters, you'd recognise that we are all distinct individuals, but you could tell just by looking at us that we're related. We need to be doing the same sort of thing in the way in which we develop institutions, whether it's military or civilian, in the different dimensions that are there. If we can do that, and it's it has to be a conscious process, then I think we get the best of both worlds. Fitness for purpose plus connection so that people can see us as a holistic organism, if you like, in international affairs.
One very quick last one, the gentleman in the centre there.
Thank you. Igor Jenninson. You said that our election campaign hit the lowest possible ever in history, and our institutions are not in very good shape, public sector has problems. So what we're left with then? Media doesn't cover election campaign properly. We have lobby institutions, St. James. What else we're left with?
So what else?
What else we're left with? Election campaign not good.
Oh, what else are we left with? I wouldn't. Us.
I mentioned lobbies and St. James.
Yeah.
Part of this.
Yeah, but I don't mean us in the sense of institutions. I mean us as citizens. Look, I don't think we're a particularly virtuous nation, and I don't think we're a particularly bad nation. I think we are a nation of moderately decent people taken from around the world. What we need to do is, if our politicians won't speak to the better part of our natures, and often they won't, we need to find ways of having that conversation for ourselves. And we may need to innovate, and perhaps the hung parliament is an evidence of some innovation in what's happening in democracy. Let's hope it's a constructive form of innovation. But I believe in the end, it's us as citizens recognising that we have some duty to the present, the past and to the future to make wise choices and to exercise influence. And we've got to be prepared to accept both the challenge but also the opportunity. And what I worry about too often is not that there's an absence of idealism around such questions in Australia, but an absence of hope. I think too many people have bought the idea that they cannot affect change through their own actions, even, and particularly on large scales, when in fact, and I talk to a lot of people who think this, look, what I can deal with is my friends, my local group, when in fact history shows that if you do see yourself being prepared to be, if you want to call a pragmatic idealist, you can have the hope of making larger changes. And I just hope that we as a society take up that opportunity.
Well, Simon, I think there would have been some of us in this room who, when they saw the topic of today's discussion was ethics and foreign policy, would have thought of the response Sir Humphrey Appleby made when Jim Hacker proposed open government, where he said, Prime Minister, you can have one or the other. I think you've gone a long way to convincing a lot of us that you can have ethics and foreign policy together, and in fact one strengthens the other. So I'd like to thank you for coming along and sharing your thoughts with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please join me in thanking Simon?